morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Our topic today is ad hoc crisis team formation with my members, Abbie Fougeron, Ashley Kinder, James Brandis. And before I introduce our presenters, again, we would like to just talk a little bit about this general topic and how it relates to leadership during the pandemic. In a crisis such as we find ourselves today, we see individuals who are compelled to address a set of problems, those who look for resources and communicate their needs to other people and to other organizations. These connections can spread widely and rapidly in today's global digital environment. Very quickly, ad hoc teams comprise of disparate and unexpected members who begin to form together. The question is, how do we optimize this team makeup and performance is one of the important avenues to consider. One other idea to consider as well is, what is the expected output of these spontaneous teams? Very clearly, we have all seen the rampant repurposing of resources to meet the variety of needs to solve these problems during the pandemic. And lastly, what we want to try to do is, from our speakers and also to gain, is what do we consider these teams to apply to both our normal daily operations and help us to prepare for the next crisis or pandemic. So first, I'd like to present our first presenter, Dr. Lundy Campbell. He's the Chief of Cardiothoracic Anesthesia at the University of California in San Francisco. Dr. Campbell is also an intensivist who traveled and worked in the ICU unit in New York City during the initial onslaught of the COVID-19 in the spring. He also has experience in the areas of global health and international physician education. And he also led an ad hoc team, surgical team, to perform a lung resection of a 500-pound gorilla and had a previous career as a naval pilot landing on aircraft carriers. Very impressive. We are pleased to have him share his insight and experiences today. Dr. Campbell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Let me open up my slides here. Which it's not showing. Hang on. Try that again. Apologize. Having technical difficulties, I really apologize for that. Can you see? You can't see my slides, it looks like, right? Can you guys hear me?
We can see them. Mm-hmm.
You can see the slides?
We can see them. Yep, they're just not in the slideshow. So if you want to play from current slide or play from start.
Yeah. How about now? Better?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Yes. All right, perfect. A little technical difficulty, sorry. So I'm going to talk about a couple things today. Both my experience in New York during the COVID-19 crisis, with an emphasis on team building. And then also I'm going to compare some team building that I'm doing now for an international project on ventilator and critical care project that's underway, also for COVID, that's currently going on. So starting with New York Presbyterian and Queens Hospital, I've got little things coming to my slide. I don't know if you're seeing them, but UCSF, the hospital I work at, has a relationship with New York Presbyterian Hospital. And Queens was one of the hardest hit regions in New York City. Basically, Queens and the Bronx were hit very hard based on their population. And because of our relationship we have with the New York Presbyterian system, which includes Cornell and Columbia and also some outlying hospitals, that's why we went to New York City. Queens was the place I went to. And when I got there, Queens Hospital has approximately about 500 staff beds normally. We did see that there was about 100 patients a day that were coming into the emergency room. And but the hospital itself had over 700 patients in the hospital for a 500-bed hospital. So they were just crammed in every possible place. There normally is about 40 beds for intensive care, and we had about 110 to 120 patients in those ICU beds. So we were making makeshift ICU beds elsewhere throughout the hospital. That included the cafeteria. And then that left a few other patients, approximately about 15 to 20 based on the day, who were based on the general medicine ward. So basically where you would normally have not very sick patients, we had very, very critically ill patients. And that was very challenging because you're not in a position where you can take care of those patients easily. So the initial phase when we got there, we sent basically 9 nurses and 12 physicians. Those physicians were divided between this Queens Hospital I went to and also Cornell Medical Center. And then we sent a second wave of individuals later on for 2 weeks. So the first wave as which I was there, we were there for about 4 weeks. Second wave was there for 2 weeks, and that was all physicians and 1 nurse practitioner who came to Queens Hospital. We'll talk a little bit more about what that was like. Basically, we had about what happened at Queens, what made it worse was as soon as this pandemic really hit and the hospital was overwhelmed, a good quarter to a third of the workforce stayed home. And nothing, I'm not saying anything against that. Those people have made choices based on issues that they had within their own life. They had to take care of their kids or their parents or whatever, and they just didn't feel like they could work and then also they were worried about bringing the virus home every day. The morale of the people who did stay was absolutely incredible. Everybody pitched in. Everybody really rose to the occasion. However, people were incredibly tired and overworked when we got there. And there were some volunteers who came also from other places, many of which were not really overly qualified. I mean, it was great that they volunteered and came, but some people just did not have the training or the experience to be able to really effectively do well in that environment. How we integrated into the workforce was basically we were put into the ICU rotation, and that was basically either the general ICUs or the intensive care unit patients that were outside on a general medicine ward. Pretty much worked when I first got there, I worked about 8 days straight, and then we'd work about, then we kind of settled into this 3 days on, a couple days off, each day about 13 hours long, and then kind of either day or night shifts. And that allowed the regular physicians that were working there some more time off and more days off. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to do on your days off. We were kind of stuck in a place to sleep. You did catch up on your sleep quite a bit. It was pretty taxing, but not much to do other than just kind of sleep and eat. The balance of my experience I found was there were some challenges and there were some very commendable things. What was commendable was that there was an excellent use of teams within that medical system. And there was really this deep camaraderie that developed within all the providers that everybody really wanted to try to do the best that they could. We had a lot of lack of supplies, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And but they were innovative in the way in which they got around that. Very strong sense of purpose. And the people that were there really accepted our help with poise and grace. Some of the challenges, however, this kind of came up very rapidly. We had all said that we would like to go to New York City if we could. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to send anybody because we weren't sure if we were going to get hit with a crisis here in California. So we kind of waited around. Finally, the hospital said, yeah, you can go. This is on a Wednesday. And they said, and by the way, you're leaving on Saturday. So there was really limited advanced preparation for that trip, kind of unclear logistics as to when we got there, as to how we'd get around. And a lot of that we had to just kind of work on our own. Initially, it was a little bit difficult to integrate into the system. I didn't know the medical record. They got me emergency privileges, but beyond that, I was kind of on my own and kind of thrown in the deep end to kind of figure all that out. The people that were there just did not have the bandwidth to be able to do anything other than what they were doing to take care of patients. So you just had to kind of figure it out on your own, on the fly. There had been a real overemphasis on physicians and ventilators, and that I think was propagated by the media. Plenty of ventilators, but not enough other stuff. And again, I'll talk a little bit about that. And then really within that, there was a lack of other key personnel and supplies. Some of the volunteers were a little bit on the difficult side. There was one group in particular which kind of came in and said, okay, let me show you how it's all done, which was really off-putting to everybody that worked there. Thankfully, they were not from our group. What we did find is that everybody really had a major role to play, and they really leveraged the use of everyone that was at that place. So they had the anesthesiologists that were kind of forming these intubation teams that would go around the hospital and put people on ventilators. These patients tend to be very sick, and we tend to flip them over from on their back to on their stomach once or a couple times a day, which improves the oxygen delivery, oxygenation of their lungs. And normally that's done by the bedside nurses, but they got a bunch of orthopedic surgeons to come in there and do that for them, and that was really nice. And then they had vascular surgeons that would come in and put in place intravenous lines and everything else. And so everybody really pitched in and did stuff. So anybody who could perform any roles would do it. It's kind of an all hands on deck mentality. As I talked about the challenges, the big challenges for us were really lack of equipment. We lacked dialysis machines, dialysis nurses. Frequently you'd have to go in, you might have, say, I'm trying not to make this too technical, but let's say you had in your ICU 10 patients that were in kidney failure. You might have the ability to put 2 of those patients on dialysis. And so you'd have to make a decision on a daily basis to which patients you would decide to dialyze that day. Clearly that did not lead to better outcomes. Most of those patients died. There was a lack of medications. We lacked medications to sedate patients, to paralyze them as necessary to keep them on the ventilator. There's a lack of trained personnel, respiratory therapists to run the ventilators, intensive care unit nurses, technicians to get x-rays and that kind of stuff. And then there was just a difficulty because of all that, obtaining studies and laboratories and everything else for your patients. What I took away from that was a couple things, which I've been using currently in my practice, is that the personal protective equipment that we all talk about definitely works. Everybody that went there did fine. Nobody got COVID. It was kind of nice. But there was a huge overemphasis, I talked about, on ventilators, especially. It was really, there were plenty of ventilators, but there was just a shortage of how to use those ventilators, like medications and everything else. Physical space, as I talked about, the dialysis machines, key personnel. I think most of that was due to a lack of a national strategy about how do you actually send supplies and equipment and personnel to places where there is, where the need is. And so it was just kind of these ad hoc teams really coming together, some better than others, or more able to provide help than others. And it was a little bit challenging. Also, any system can be overrun and become resource constrained. And that's really what happened here in New York City. And I think that could happen anywhere else in the world. And my reflections on this was that it was very challenging. There was a lot of death and suffering. It was very easy to get burned out. And there's normally a healthy relationship with physicians between being a little bit of emotional distance to your patients, so you're not, suffering along with them, and you can take care of them, but not being overly withdrawn. And that was a challenge, a very big challenge for this. And I want to contrast that with this international ventilator project, which I'm now currently working on, which briefly, just to kind of give you a little bit of background, when people send supplies or equipment to basically to some country that needs it, there's this kind of classic model, as I would call it, of sending equipment or help, which is very good intentioned people decide to send some equipment, maybe surplus. It could be what they can get a hold of. It could be what you can actually, logistically, physically send. Could be a tax write-off. Unfortunately, frequently, most of this is not helpful. And I have this picture in here, which is of a fluoroscopy machine, which is a kind of like a portable x-ray type thing. And in one of the hospitals I was at in Honduras, they had one of these things, brand new, sent to them from another hospital. It had broken in transport when it got there. They just kind of kept it, like right there in the front of the hospital as if it would do something. They couldn't use it. They had no way of fixing it, and so it was completely useless. And so why aren't these things helpful? Well, they're probably, maybe it's not what the place actually needs. It doesn't meet the local disease burden. If you send a bunch of supplies to somebody that they just don't need, they end up just getting stuffed away in a closet somewhere. They may not be able to use the equipment due to technological constraints, as I talked about, like with that fluoroscopy machine. They may have the inability to maintain the equipment or a lack of other needed supplies. Could be personnel constraints. They don't have the personnel to actually run that kind of stuff. Or it could just be ultimately nonsensical. Do you really need a state-of-the-art whatever machine when 1/3 of all women in that country die in childbirth? So that's what we're trying to look at kind of more globally with global health. And so currently the US has decided to send ventilators. And I talked a little bit about that there's this push to, there's this kind of focus on ventilators. And I think it's because we can think of ventilators as a thing that can make somebody better, but only it makes people better if you have the ability to use that ventilator. So right now, the US is pushing to get all these ventilators to other countries, and there's this organization called USAID, and some others have donated vast amounts of money to help these resource-constrained nations throughout the world. And they're really working on delivering ventilators, as you can see here. These ventilators are going to Russia. And our current project is basically coordinating with these pre-existing government agencies that are kind of there already set up in the infectious disease realm for HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. And we've looked at these countries and have said, okay, let's perform a needs-based assessment of what the local facilities are and see what they can actually do. And then we'll partner with these in-country representatives to determine what their priorities are and where we want to put these ventilators. And then when we deliver these ventilators, we want to deliver them with both all the consumables that they need. So a ventilator, this is a very high-tech portable ventilator that you're seeing there in the picture. And that's one of the ventilators actually we're using to send to them. It's really nice. It's this military spec ventilator. The ventilator does nothing if you don't have all the supplies to deliver that air to the patient. So you need an oxygen source, you need an endotracheal tube, tubing to go to the ventilator, all that kind of stuff. So they need those consumables. And then they need technical help in which to run that ventilator. And so that technical help really consists of online modules that we've developed to help set up, operate, and maintain these ventilators. We're giving technical support for their needs and trying to develop critical care best practices for these countries. And then basically technical support for ongoing critical care of these COVID patients. And the challenges to this, and this is a slide that was a very classic slide from in Afghanistan, where on a military briefing, this was put up and said, if we can just understand this, we could basically win the war. And that's unfortunately what a lot of medicine is like too. The challenges are really, it's difficult to repurpose and flex agencies to this new threat. There's a lot of different agencies in the mix, and it's very challenging. There's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles and acronyms to learn with this and kind of get around this. But ultimately, I think that they're taking this from the right standpoint of saying, let's try to do something that's going to be more of a long-term benefit to these people. And let me see if I can get out of this slideshow. Okay.
All right, I guess we're going on to presentation 2.
Yes, Dr. Campbell, again, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. Our next presenter is Dr. David Robinowitz, Professor of Anesthesia and Pediatric Anesthesiologist at the University of California, San Francisco, Beanhoff Children's Hospital. Dr. Rabinowitz is also a pediatrician. He serves as the chair of the University of California Senate Committee on Academic Computing and Communications and is the physician lead for perioperative and anesthesia informatics at UCSF. He's a member of the governance committee at Epic, one of the leading electronic health record vendors, and is a national leader in electronic health records and anesthesia. He's a leader or team member in 3 distinct innovation teams to help address COVID-19 provider safety concerns, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Rabinowitz with us today to share his observations and intellect from his projects. Dr. Rabinowitz, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Lundy. It was a great presentation, very interesting. So today, first of all, I just want to say I have no relevant disclosures and that everything I'm talking about these 3 teams is my personal interpretation and reflections, and I'm not representing any of these teams. So just my opinion. And I have some objectives, but basically I'm going to talk about 3 teams that I was a member of during the early days of COVID and continuing. And hopefully it will become fodder for talking about, what makes teams in these settings. So this all started back in March, around the time that Lundy was getting ready to go to New York. I was on the home front, so to speak. And, I had heard from family members about, in Italy, about what was going on there with their PPE shortages. And I happened to have some contacts and friends at UC Berkeley, one of our sister institutions, and asked, hey, do you have anybody in your group that might be interested in developing PPE? And one of my colleagues who does computer science says, well, not me, but we do have a bunch of PPE that we're willing to donate that we have left over from the forest fires a few years ago. And I said, I'll come by and pick it up. Well, it turned out they had a handful of N95 face masks, which really weren't going to do much. But the lab person I met said, oh, by the way, I had some used ones, but I put them in the UV light hood. Maybe they'll be okay. And that got me to thinking, maybe we could use this as a broader technique. So I mentioned that to some of my colleagues in my department who do research who happen to have UV light cabinets. And they had already thought of some similar ideas, and everybody offered to help. Through networking, I eventually met another professor at Cal Berkeley, Professor Amy Herr, who's not an expert in UV, but is a biomedical engineer. And she had her grad students and idled lab staff who were home because of the quarantine, and lots of volunteers to help. We started out with a lot of questions. Does UV kill viruses, for example? What type of UV? Where can we find calibrated UV light meters? What are the data? It's a new virus, we really didn't know. What I have here is a picture of one of these bio-isolation cabinets, very common in laboratories around the world. Ultraviolet light often to decontaminate them. And we decided that we needed to test these, and a common refrain was, hey, come to our lab and measure it, and here's my contact info. So in these days, we're really just communicating with text messages and email. We also used one of the tools that academics have, which is the scientific literature and the media. Here's an article from the New York Times about what University of Nebraska was doing with ultraviolet decontamination. So we reached out to them, and they freely shared their experience and technical details. And I would mention that later in the process, we were able to return the favor by sharing our findings. So email eventually became overwhelming as the group size became pretty large, and we ended up transitioning to Slack channels. I will mention that Slack did offer at least one of our groups, basically free use of their platform. And once we were in Slack, we eventually made connections with the N95 decontamination channel, which started off as kind of a Slack group, but eventually became a much larger organization. So this is now what N95decon.org looks like. It's actually broader than just looking at N95 decontamination. That's kind of the branding. It's now looking at kind of general issues around personal protective equipment, and not just for healthcare workers, but also the use of masks in the general population. So I'm sure anybody who hasn't been hiding in a closet knows that this is a very hot item right now in the news. The goal of N95 is not really to decontaminate anything, but rather to acquire and disseminate unbiased scientific information about N95 decontamination to inform decisions. And I think one thing that I heard in Dr. Campbell's presentation is that dissemination of knowledge and information can really be helpful. So knowing what, it's not just having the equipment, but it's having information about the equipment. So what was going on in early March? Well, we knew that there was a critical need for information about reusing N95s. There's a limited global capacity of N95 production. Some of it's actually centered in Wuhan, China, of all places. So their production had gone down drastically. With the novel virus, we didn't have specific established scientific literature, and there were a lot of low quality recommendations which were circulating on the internet already. So we felt the time was of the essence, that this information needed to get out quickly, but it was also very important to do it correctly. Accuracy was important. We didn't want to distribute information and then have to retract it. So at that time, there was little to no formal human resources process in the group. Everybody was a volunteer. Initially, there were no formal job descriptions, but as needs became apparent, then formal jobs were kind of added. And we ended up having folks who were expert in administration, meeting organizations, keeping people on task, then people who assist with writing and formatting, website development and maintenance. And then also we had a number of folks who were doing novel research on these techniques. We didn't have a formal team charter, but it was implied. And really kind of what I heard from Dr. Campbell, everybody rolled up their sleeves and contributed however they could. And over time, in terms of morale maintenance, the meetings included also celebrations of accomplishment, motivations, and then acknowledgement of people's hard work and kind of gratitude. Some of the strengths that we had in our team was we had a clear purpose, there was a public need. We all had institutional support. So for example, UCSF and Stanford were very supportive, but we also had independence. There was a wide variety of scientific and technical expertise, from physicists to clinicians. We had the use of laboratories that had been shuttered because of stay-at-home orders. There were several people with experience creating startups, and then a lot of personal connections around the country with other academics, people we had trained with, people we had known from other professional collaborations. And then many people also came with management skills, having had experience running labs or running a division or running a department, an academic department. Some of the potential weaknesses were that we didn't have, for example, endogenous legal expertise. We weren't manufacturers, and we didn't have specific expertise in every potential decontamination technique. Really every week we were hearing about a new process, for example, hydrogen peroxide or ethylene oxide or ultraviolet. But what we did have was a very strong scientific foundation and a lot of motivation, and people quickly got up to speed with reviewing the literature and consulting experts. One concern was that there was a potential for intra-group competition. That's a very academic feature that, Stanford versus Cal, for example. But really that didn't pan out. And we'll talk about that in the culture of academics. So our culture was an academic culture, and you could think of this process as retooling the academic factory for a new challenge. So there's a challenge of how can we, have resiliency of personal protective equipment so that we're not dependent on disposable, impossible to find equipment. Most of the participants were faculty or students, so we're deep in the academic culture. As I mentioned, we had available time as classes were canceled and labs were closed. And our work was in line with institutional goals. So we did have institutional support for using some of our time in these endeavors. And the academic culture also meant we were experienced in research techniques and how to acquire scientific knowledge. I would say the individual characteristics were there were a lot of self-starting people. There wasn't a lot of need to motivate people to be engaged. These were volunteers who hit the ground running when they started. And as I mentioned, there was some concern about intra-group competition, but it really seemed that competition was on hold due to the crisis. And we've had many conversations about imagine if this could be the new normal, where academic collaboration kind of trump competition. So one question I had was what leadership style would be best for this group? And I would say the main leader of this group kind of emerged as a professor, Dr. Manu Prakash from Stanford. And I would say his style and the style of the other leadership of the group was generally democratic, with consensus building being the focus. However, there were times when we had to kind of transition to more of an authoritarian leadership style where we just had to get things done. For example, we started having Zoom meetings with tens of people, many agenda items, having to get through an agenda. And sometimes he would have to say, okay, we're moving along to the next topic, and also to meet deadlines. The leadership style was also informed by distribution. So we formed semi-autonomous subgroups. So you can see here's some screenshots from, let me just minimize my zoom. Some screenshots from the current N95D that kind of shows about some organization. So some different techniques of decontamination. Each of these had a separate group. And then also some general topics. But within each group, we tried to keep the workflow to be consistent and standardized. So each of these techniques, for example, you can see has a fact sheet, which has just the facts on a single sheet of paper. And then a technical report, which is a very detailed underlying scientific review, for those of you in medicine, kind of like a Cochrane review of the technique. And so we agreed on the standardized workflow. So whatever you're looking at, you're comparing apples to apples in terms of style and substance. And let's see what's going on. So in terms of decision-making strategy, Dr. Prakash was the overall facilitator. And as I mentioned, we looked for consensus. This was especially important for critical issues, such as when we talked about our legal strategy and liability, where really everyone had to be on board. And let me just make sure that's not a message from you saying you can't hear me. I'll turn that off, sorry about that. Everyone was heard was one of our principles. Now, when decisions had to be made quickly, we transitioned to a majority vote, but I feel that really consensus actually worked in this group. When there was conflict and negotiation, I think an academic culture played a role. With academic conflict, often evidence is what we use as our weapon of choice, so to speak. But I think our conflict was respectful, and the concept of having a peer review and colleagues as the jury was helped to solve problems. A key conflict that we had, and this is part of a crisis, is that we wanted to get out information quickly, but we also wanted it to be accurate. And I was reminded of a sign at a print shop I used to go to that said, you can have it cheap, fast, or good, pick two. And so we were looking for fast and good, so it wasn't cheap in terms of the amount of effort and resources that were applied. What technology did we use? Well, we certainly used the tools we already knew from our academic life, such as researching and publication tools. As I mentioned, Slack really facilitated our communication. We used shared Google Documents to do joint writing processes. And we had video conferences initially 7 days per week. And one thing that helped to make that more effective was that there was a circulation of a pre-meeting agenda. And Dr. Prakash is really expert focus management to keep things moving while respecting everyone's input. I will say that Zoom comes with its pros and cons. There's certainly the well-known Zoom fatigue. But one big advantage is that we had no travel time and that we can include people from around the country. So as the group got larger, we brought in more expertise. There was some concern, would we have overwhelming participation? Would meetings be untenable with too many participants? And there was also concern about something that I think has been called Brooks' Law, which is that it takes resources to bring people up to speed. And I think Lundy illustrated that when he came on board, just who had time to kind of show him the way and how does our computer system work? Because bringing in new people, although they bring new resources, also brings in the cost of getting them up to speed. Fortunately, this was not an issue, and I'll show you why in the next slide. We also had concerns about, would we bring in disruptive influences? And that didn't happen. Really, everyone who came was on the same page and just motivated to contribute. We did have a small security issue as the group became bigger. There was some pre-release of working documents, and they spread like a virus, as you would imagine. And we wanted to maintain control of these documents, so as new scientific information came on board, that we could control those documents and make sure they're kept up to date and accurate. As the group expanded, although there wasn't a formal organizational tree, more structure just kind of developed out of necessity. Formal documentation seemed to be the antidote to Brooks' Law, and that basically is if you keep good meeting notes and your documents have a historical trail, it's easier for somebody else to come on, read what's been going on, and get up to speed very quickly. And so maybe in a crisis, it would be good to have some information for doctors, say, coming onto your hospital about here's how to get up to speed. Here's your small handbook on how to use our system and how to hit the ground running. Easy to do if you have advance warning, but hard to do in the midst of a crisis. We moved some portions of our work behind a password firewall, and we improved editorial processes. And I say we, that's really the team. My role in many of these things was minimal. In terms of some other compartmentalization, there were volunteers to be media facing, and those folks received particular training on how to work with the media, and it protected other team members' time and their inboxes. So I'm going to quickly transition to just talk briefly about two other projects. One was about the same time. There was a lot of interest about developing new PPE technologies that could protect healthcare workers. And although you heard from Dr. Campbell that in many settings, the PPE that we have works, you know, at the time, we really didn't know what the characteristics of spread within the hospital was. And this is a device that came out of the original SARS, SARS-1. A Taiwanese anesthesiologist, Dr. Xian Young, who developed something called the intubation box or aerosol box. And this was copied in many other countries and got a lot of interest after a letter was published in the New England Journal of Medicine demonstrating that it was very good at maintaining droplet containment. And here's an ultraviolet picture of fluorescent dye when the box wasn't used, and another picture shows it working very well. So these devices spread all over the country, lots of different designs, lots of companies offering to manufacture them for free or for a charge. And, but we were concerned about what is the role of aerosol in transmission. And we noticed that in the original documentation that they didn't really talk about aerosols. And other folks in the literature also had this question, you know, what about aerosols? And are these boxes actually worth it in terms of interfering with patient care, and do they actually provide protection? So it turned out that several other groups around the Bay Area were interested in the same question, and there were a lot of people doing similar work. And so we created a joint kind of informal task force among several institutions. And here's some example institutions that participated in their devices. What are the strengths of the team that we formed? Well, we had a lot of expertise in ergonomics and simulation on the group. That is, how much will these boxes interfere with doing your job? We had facilities to do testing because many parts of our peri-op centers were empty as we had stopped elective procedures. And people had time because of reduced OR volume to focus on these questions. We did some basic tests, but we realized one of our weaknesses was that we didn't have within the group expertise in fluid gas dynamics and aerosols. But we did a literature search and we found that in fact there was a national expert at UC Davis, which is only a 2-hour drive from San Francisco, and email led to an agreement to collaborate. I think some of the other weaknesses we had were that we were disparate groups representing different medical centers, some private practice, some county hospital, and then also an academic center. So we had some different goals. You know, are we trying to figure out the science behind these, or are we trying to get these up and running so that we can get our ORs, you know, going again, so to speak? We didn't really have a leadership or governance structure, only consensus. And I would say that one of our barriers was that we had a lot of scheduling conflicts, and getting the whole group together was challenging. What was the product of this team? Well, there's now a evaluative paper that's currently under peer review using data from the aerosol lab that we collected at UC Davis. I would say, however, that just this week, a paper came out from a group in Australia that probably beat us to the punch, but we use a different set of methods, so hopefully our paper will still contribute to the literature and understanding. And perhaps we were a bit late to the party, so to speak, because of the consensus model of getting things done. And there were a lot of people involved in these teams, just wanted to acknowledge them. The final project I want to talk about very briefly is something called the UC PAPR project. So as these other groups were happening, some other Berkeley colleagues heard that there were UC faculty interested in working on PPE, and 2 electrical engineering faculty offered to help by designing an inexpensive PAPR respirator. So what is a PAPR? A powered air purified respirator. And basically it's a device that blows filtered air, presumably virus-free, into a hood. And it can take the place of an N95, and one advantage of them over N95s are just much more comfortable for wearing for long periods of time, and probably a little bit higher protection in many settings. This was our early inspiration, something that was out on social media, an anesthesiologist with no N95 and PAPR, who made his own PAPR by pumping oxygen into a plastic bag, and this had a lot of problems. So our engineer decided to go a little bit further and really looking at something that could be used not only in the United States, but also in resource limited settings. And this is using a polypropylene bag that costs 10 cents, or polyethylene bag rather, that costs 10 cents, and having a consumable of 10 cents per use. And provides protection, whole face protection, and pretty easy to work with actually. So my colleague and I, Dr. Saul at UC, we instantly saw the potential for this, but we had a big catch-22, which is that in order to get certification from the federal government, we needed to have a mature product, but in order to develop a mature product, it helped to have certification. We also needed funding, and then there were supply chain issues about timely procurement of the materials we would need to produce these at scale. We did have some strengths. We had university support. They generously offered some seed money. We had some non-clinical time that we could use, and we had local expertise within the medical center, infection control, critical care faculty to evaluate things, legal advice, and then procurement assistance with some of our raw materials. One of our strengths was that we were highly motivated. So we knew that there were people like Dr. Campbell and others in New York and around the world who needed personal protection equipment that was inexpensive. And so we felt there was an urgency. I would say maybe one of our weaknesses was also this sense of urgency, and that there were some holes in our technical expertise, and that maybe had we taken some more time, we would have filled them in quicker. So what happened? Well, we distributed our roles based on our expertise and tasks assigned. Again, it was by consensus, but it was a small, highly motivated group. We did have grad students and laboratory staff that offered support. Even families got involved in supporting the project. And as we got bigger and had a budget, we started using project management software and a more formal engagement. And this is a later model of the device. And here's one of my colleagues, Dr. Saul, trying it out in a clinical setting. And here's more fully diagrammed pictures of the device, still with our polyethylene bag. So we did send off our devices to the National Personal Protective Testing Laboratory, a part of NIOSH and the CDC. And unfortunately, we failed certification. We did learn a lot. I think some things we learned were that the formal evaluation that we got from the CDC was different than our initial informal contacts that we had, which was really encouraging us to send things. I think we learned also that regulations do not take a holiday during a crisis unless specifically changed in the law. So we may have, taken some liberties with the exact specification in the regulations, and we learned that no, one does not do that. And so that was really important, even though we had kind of gotten the impression that it would be okay under the emergency authorization. And the rejection also gave us some guidance for design changes. So I would say we were all pretty crushed. We weren't expecting the rejection. We took off the weekend to regroup and had what we would call in medicine a mortality report. We took stock of our missteps, tried to avoid blame, and then made a new strategic plan. And at that point also, the New York City situation had cooled off, and so we felt a little bit less time pressure. A competitor had entered the market with a similar product, but we still felt that ours met the need for being affordable and flexible, especially for use in resource-limited settings. So what's going on now is we have Model 2. We've brought on more expertise to fill the gaps in our knowledge. So we've collaborated with some other folks at Stanford. We also have a relationship now with a major filter manufacturer. We have a new design to make sure that we're meeting the specifications to a T for certification. And we're also engaging a commercial testing lab to pre-evaluate, test the device before we send it off. And I just want to say thank you to all the teams that were part of, that I described in this presentation. And thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinowitz. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. We appreciate the insights that you've shared with us today. Thank you for taking the time and presenting to the group. Any questions we will be sure to send out to you. Unfortunately, we do need to move on to the next session at this point, but thank you so much for your time and energy spent towards sharing your experiences with us today. There is a link in the chat box for everyone to select that. You'll need to end this session, select the link in the chat box in order to join the final session. So thank you all very much. Have a great day. We'll see you at the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.